Hello, this is Dr. Rudabaugh. This is the Unit 3, and this is really on geology, and it covers Chapter 10 in your online readings, but you will really only need to cover, you'll be covering Chapter 10, kind of broken down in two parts, A through O here, topics. Make up Chapter 10, and then you scroll down into Chapter 11, it covers O through AH. So, there's really only one chapter, but it's so long and it covers such a wide variety of topics in geology that we do break it up. So when I click on chapter 10 here, you'll see it open up, and here's the book. You'll go down through here in chapter 10 and you'll cover topics A through O, and you'll stop right there. So here's your first group of topics for chapter 10. I'm going to go ahead and start with the rock cycle, and I'm going to go through some of these more than others. I won't have time to go through all of them, but some of them are all obviously more important than others. And so I'll start with section A. And obviously, if you're talking about geology, you begin and end with talking about rocks and the rock cycle. And the key thing for us to understand is that all of geology ultimately comes back to what makes up the matter on the Earth's surface. And we have three types of rocks: igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. And basically, the study of geology is the dynamic mechanisms that take the oldest rocks on Earth, which are igneous, and through a series of erosional and weathering processes of how igneous processes can be broken down into layers on a riverbed to form sedimentary rocks, or then sedimentary rocks could then be buried under sediments, and under enough pressure and enough heat could be morphed into the third type of metamorphic rocks. And then sometimes through metamorphism, some metamorphic rocks could then be actually transformed back into igneous rocks. This is the rock cycle is this dynamic, never-ending process that basically shows of how rocks, some of these transformations occur above the surface, many of them are below the surface. And that'll be the neat thing for you to kind of study throughout the chapter, both chapters, is how basically chapter 10 talks about how rocks are created and lifted up to make like mountain ranges. And then chapter 11 really focuses in on the weathering process and the erosional processes that convert igneous rocks and reposition them and transform them into sedimentary rock layers, which maybe the most famous example would be like the Grand Canyon for that type of rock. And also if you bury rocks deep enough, how under heat and pressure they can transform into metamorphic rocks. So really chapter 10 really fills with how rocks or new rocks are formed, and chapter 11 really focuses in on how they're transformed and they go through metamorphosis into other types of rocks. So the rock cycle, and there are plenty of great YouTube videos on this, and we actually have a review assignment on this that we'll go into. One of my favorite topics is geologic time. And when we look at the Earth and its age of 4.6 billion years old, you see a lot of charts like this. That in this one, you're starting at the most modern era and into time, which is at the very bottom, is the oldest. A variety of radiometric dating techniques to date the age of rocks. And when we look at the oldest rocks, you could kind of see how the Earth over time has changed with these descriptions. And I really like this column over here, major geologic milestones, but because it could kind of tell you what's going on in the era of what was happening during this period of time. But geologists talk a lot about deep time. And we break time down over 4.6 billion years into eons, eras, periods, and epochs. And for example, I am a dinosaur nut, and I love to study the dinosaurs. And the dinosaur period is really broken down into these three periods here: Cretaceous, Jurassic, and Triassic. And this is known as the age of dinosaurs. So if I was to tell somebody as a geologist, what's your favorite period? Well, my favorite periods are the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And ironically, this is where we often see a lot of our fossil fuels that we use today. They were created during this time in swamps that cover much of, for example, Illinois used to be covered by a lot of swampland in a tropical climate. Probably looked a lot like Brazil today. But so the periods were the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, and the era was the Mesozoic. And one of the interesting things, like a paleontologist would tell you, is when we look at fossil and date them to these periods, we know that humans and dinosaurs never interacted, because modern humans, as we find evidence from anthropologists, they don't occur till about 10,000 years ago, where we begin to see the first developments of human civilization and society. Now, we know earlier forms of humans occurred in deeper past, but probably the earliest humans fossils somewhere date back to the Pliocene in this epoch right through here. So you could see really humans are really the new kids on the block. No pun intended for people who know 80s music, but relatively speaking, you could see how young of a species we are. But if you ever go to the Grand Canyon, or you're a lover of geology, you begin to realize that it is geologists who really look at the deepest scan of time, and they have a very specific, organized way that, in fact, even biologists actually organize the development of their life and species, because in the rock records that we track over different periods, we see fossil evidence that we even help biologists understand the history of life on Earth. So this is something that if you got in and took a more advanced class in geology, you would really come to know this table, and you might end up becoming an expert in a certain period or time. But for this class, we kind of just generally get familiar with it from an understanding of what is the periodic table, and how does it organize time into eons, eras, periods, and epochs. And you could clearly see with the Earth over 4.6 billion years, we've had very distinctive areas. And again, if you're a dinosaur nut, these are the periods here that you really would go after. But then if you would like, for example, to study animals before the dinosaurs, say like amphibians and more primitive reptiles, you would go back to even earlier periods like the Permian or the Pennsylvanian or the Mississippian. Well, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next section. I'll have time to do one more. And I'll go to section C here on concepts of uniformitarianism. And this is just a great concept to understand how geologists work. This uniformitarianism is this idea of how do geologists tell the story of time. And prior to the late 70s, the general consensus is that it was a series of catastrophic events that changed the Earth over very quick, short periods of time, with very violent short-term events. Then in the late 1700s, we had this sort of transformation where we had a series of scientists, one by the name of like James Hutton here, and they came along and said, really, geology is working on very slow time scales, and we can actually study things of the present, because things that are happening now were probably likely happening in the past. So if you want to understand a mountain or a valley, or understanding why certain landscapes look the way they do, if you could see the forces that are shaping them now, we could understand how they could have been shaped way much earlier in time, millions of years earlier. And the general consensus came to the conclusion that a series of scientists came along and developed this idea that through studying uniformitarianism and through a series of slow processes that were occurring over time, that these processes were ultimately that were shaping the world that we lived in today. One of the neat things about it that is not mentioned here is that came out of this is the deeper you go back in the land, as you dig deeper and deeper into the land, you go back into time. And literally through uniformitarianism, we understood that as you dug into the ground, it was like opening like a textbook and being able to go back and see like layers of the earth. And the deeper you went, generally we understood that to be going back into deeper time. This concept of uniformitarianism actually began to be the hallmark of some later work by people in the biological arena like Charles Darwin, who based their theories of evolution on some of the advances that were in geology. And this is why I always like studying geology and geography, is because we could see its interconnections with so many of the other disciplines. But no place can you go to see probably these uniformitarianism more dynamically displayed is to go and do a YouTube search of how the Grand Canyon was formed. Watch a YouTube video and watch a geologist explain to you the processes that created the Grand Canyon, and I think you would really begin to appreciate how the theory and concept of uniformitarianism really began to change the way we understand and use geology today. Now, I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to have you read on the characteristics and of igneous rocks, sedimentary rocks, and metamorphic rocks, bearing in mind that we know that igneous rocks are the oldest rocks on the planet, and then kind of look at the chemical signatures of how do we know when an igneous rock changes into a sedimentary rock or a metamorphic rock. And obviously there are different types of rocks that represent each type of class. Some of these rocks are rocks that are valuable resources that power our homes. Some of them are used as materials that we use to make furniture or tables. Some of them are energy sources that power the Industrial Revolution. So I'm going to skip over these sections, and when we come back, I'm going to kind of go into section H, and I'm going to skip down through the processes that get into the themes of plate tectonics. But bear in mind, when we talk about plate tectonics, the force of plate tectonics is obviously playing a role of influencing and driving the rock cycle itself.